The first drop of coffee hit the diner floor with a sharp, ugly splash, and in that exact moment, every conversation inside the room died. Because the sheriff's deputy didn't spill it by accident, he tilted the cup slowly on purpose, smiling as the dark liquid ran down and spread near the paws of the German shepherd sitting perfectly still beside the booth. And the silence that followed was heavier than the clatter of plates, heavier than the hum of the old ceiling fans, because everyone understood this wasn't about coffee at all. The man in the booth didn't move right away, didn't raise his voice, didn't even flinch, even though the uniformed men standing around him were watching closely, waiting for something they could mock or punish. And he simply kept one hand resting lightly on the table, while the other stayed near the dog's collar, calm and steady, as if he were holding back more than just an animal, as if he were holding back years of discipline carved into muscle and bone. Before we begin, don't forget to hit like, repost, or share. And I'm really curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Back to the story. Luna, the German shepherd, felt the tension before anyone else did, her ears twitching as the smell of hot coffee mixed with fear and arrogance. Yet she stayed seated, eyes locked on her handler's face, trusting him completely, because she had been trained to read his breathing, his posture, the smallest shift in energy, and right now he was a wall, quiet and unshaken.
You heard me. I said clean it up, tough guy, and make it quick.
Clean it up, the deputy said, his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear, while another officer laughed behind him, nudging his friend as if this were nothing more than cheap entertainment during a slow shift. And a few customers looked away, pretending to study menus they weren't reading, because it was easier than stepping in. The waitress froze near the counter, hands shaking around a coffee pot, her eyes darting between the badges and the man in camouflage, because something about him didn't fit, from the way he sat straight despite the insult to the way his gaze never dropped, calm but sharp, like a blade still in its sheath. Slowly, deliberately, the man looked down at the spreading mess, then back up at the deputy, and for a split second his eyes changed, not with anger, but with recognition. The kind that comes when you've seen this behavior before in places far darker than a roadside diner, places where power was abused and mercy was rare. "You done?" he asked quietly, his voice even, controlled, carrying no threat at all, which somehow made it worse for the men bullying him, because bullies crave reaction, not restraint. The deputy scoffed, leaning closer, his badge nearly brushing the man's chest. And that was when he noticed the dog again, really noticed her, the way her muscles were coiled, the way her eyes tracked every movement without aggression, without fear, just readiness. "Nice dog," the deputy said, smirking, nudging the cup with his boot and pushing the mess closer. Shame if she got trained to bite the wrong person. At that, the man finally stood, slowly enough that no one could claim he was being aggressive, and as he rose to his full height, the room felt smaller somehow, tighter, because the air around him changed, and even the laughing officer behind the deputy stopped smiling, sensing something he couldn't explain, something old and dangerous and patient. The man reached into his pocket, not fast, not sudden, and pulled out a worn set of dog tags, letting them hang loosely in his hand as he looked the deputy straight in the eye. And in a voice still calm, still controlled, he said, "You might want to rethink how you're starting this day." No one knew it yet, but the mistake had already been made, and it wasn't about coffee or a dog or pride. It was about the fact that these men had chosen the wrong stranger, because the quiet man standing in that diner had survived things they only pretended to be brave enough to face, and he had learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous response is patience. The dog tags caught the light for only a second, but that second was enough to shift something in the deputy's expression, not because he understood what they meant, but because confidence like that, calm after humiliation, usually came from experience, not bravado. And the diner felt even quieter as the man let the tags fall back against his palm and sat down again without being told. "You think that scares me?" the deputy said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land, glancing at his partners for support. And one of them chuckled a little too loudly, though his eyes kept flicking toward the German shepherd, who hadn't moved an inch, hadn't growled, hadn't broken discipline, as if she were carved from stone. The man finally looked around the diner, meeting the eyes of the people pretending not to watch, and his voice carried just enough to be heard without turning into a speech, calm but weighted with truth. "I came in here to eat, same as everyone else. I didn't come looking for trouble." "That's so," the deputy replied, crossing his arms, "because trouble seems to follow dogs like that." The man nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "sometimes it does. Mostly when people don't know when to stop." That was when the elderly cook behind the counter cleared his throat, his voice trembling but determined. "Son," he said to the deputy, "maybe you should just leave him be." The deputy turned sharply, anger flashing, but before he could answer, the diner door opened and a tall man in a pressed uniform stepped inside, his presence immediate and undeniable, eyes scanning the room until they locked on to the scene by the booth. "Sheriff," one of the laughing officers muttered under his breath. The sheriff walked over slowly, taking in the spilled coffee, the rigid posture of his deputies, the man in camouflage, and finally the German shepherd, whose gaze followed him calmly, assessing but not threatening. "What's going on here?" he asked. Before anyone else could speak, the man in the booth stood again, this time turning slightly so the sheriff could see the patch on his sleeve and the insignia he'd never bothered to hide because he'd never needed to. "No trouble," he said, "just having breakfast." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, recognition flickering as he noticed the unit markings, the posture, the scars that didn't come from training accidents. His tone changed instantly. "Sir," he said carefully, "may I see some ID?" He handed it over without ceremony, and as the sheriff read it, his face drained of color, his jaw tightening as reality set in, because the name in front of him belonged to someone briefed about in closed rooms, someone who didn't make headlines, someone whose record didn't fit on one page. He handed the ID back with both hands. "My apologies," he said firmly, then turned to his deputies, his voice dropping to a level that carried real authority. "All of you, outside, now." No one argued, no one laughed. Chairs scraped as the deputies retreated, their confidence gone, replaced by something closer to fear. The man sat back down, finally exhaling, and Luna relaxed, just a fraction, pressing her shoulder against his leg, and he rested his hand on her head, grounding them both. The waitress approached slowly.